Section 11 of Popular Superstitions and the Truths Contained Therein. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Popular Superstitions and the Truths Contained Therein by Herbert Mayo. Letter 11, Supplemental, Abnormal Neuropsychical Relation, Cautions Necessary in Receiving Trance Communications, Trance Visiting, Mesmerizing at a Distance and by the Will, Mesmeric Diagnosis and Treatment of Disease, Prevision, Ultra-Vital Vision. The principal alterations made in the letters for the present edition comprise an expansion of my account of trances of spontaneous occurrence and the introduction of greater precision into our elementary conceptions of the relations of the mind and nervous system. Letters 5, 6, 7, and 8 establish that the most startling phenomena in popular superstitions and the most wonderful performances by mesmerized persons are but repetitions of events, the occurrence of which as symptoms of, or as constituting certain rare forms of nervous attacks, have been independently authenticated and put on record by physicians of credit. Letters 2 and 9 exemplify the mode in which superstition has dressed up trance phenomena, as letters 3 and 4 display the contributions she has levied on sensorial illusions, the odd force, and normal exoneural psychical phenomena. Letter 10 describes the method of inducing trances artificially, whereby they may be reproduced at pleasure, either in the interests of philosophical inquiry or for important practical purposes. I dedicate the present letter to the reconsideration of the most knotty points already handled, and to the investigation of a few other questions, the solution of which is not less difficult. 1. Hypothesis of an abnormal psychico-neural relation as the essence of trance. I admit that it is a very clumsy expedient to assume that the mind can, as it were, get loose in the living body, and while remaining there in a partially new alliance, exercise some of its faculties in unaccustomed organs, which organs lose for the same time their normal participation in consciousness, and farther that the mind can partially indeed, but so completely disengage itself from the living body that its powers of apprehension may range with what we are accustomed to consider the properties of free spirit unlimitedly as to space and time. I adopt the hypothesis upon compulsion, that is to say, because I see no other way of accounting for the most remarkable trance phenomena. In due time it is to be expected that a simple inductive expression of the facts will take the place of my hypothetical explanation, but not the less may the latter, crude as it is, prove of temporary use by bringing together in a connected view many new and diversified phenomena, and planting the subject in a position favorable for scientific scrutiny. Let me arrange in their most persuasive order the facts which seem to justify the hypothesis above enunciated. 1. In many cases of waking trance, the patient does not see with his eyes, hear with his ears, nor taste with his tongue, and the sense of touch appears to have deserted the skin. At the same time the patient sees, hears, and tastes things applied to the pit of the stomach, or sees and hears with the back of the head or tips of the fingers. 2. In the first imperfect trance, waking from initiatory trance, the patient's apprehension of sensuous impressions often appears to have entirely deserted his own body, and to be in relation with the sentient apparatus in his mesmerizer's frame, for if you pull his hair or put mustard in his mouth, he does not feel either, but he is actually alive to the sensations which these impressions excite. If the hair of the mesmerizer is pulled or mustard placed on the mesmerizer's tongue, the sensations excited thus in the mesmerizer, and these alone the entranced person realizes as his own sensations. 3. About the same time, the entranced person displays no will of his own, but his voluntary muscles execute the gestures which his mesmerizer is making, even when standing behind his back. His will takes its guidance from sympathy with the exerted will of the other. 4. Presently, if his trance faculties continue to be developed, the entranced person enters into communication with the entire mind of his mesmerizer. His apprehension seems to penetrate the brain of the latter, and is capable of reading all his thoughts. 5. In the last 3 steps, the apprehension of the entranced person appears to have left his own being to the extent described, and to have entered into relation with the mind or nervous system of another person. Now, if the patient becomes still more lucid, his apprehension seems to range abroad through space, and to identify material objects, and penetrate the minds of other human beings at indefinite distances. 6. At length, the entranced person displays the power of revealing future events, a power which, as far as it relates to things separate from his own bodily organization or that of others, seems to me to show that his apprehension is in relation with higher spiritual natures, or with the fountain of truth itself. In the following pages I have given examples of those of the powers here attributed to very lucid clairvoyance, which I have not previously instanced. 2. Transposition of the senses. No doubt these phenomena, irregular as they seem at present, follow a definite law, which has to be determined by future observations and experiments. Mr. Williamson found some of his clairvoyants, see with the back of the head, some with the side of the head, some best at 7 inches, others at as many feet off. In the case which Mr. Bull Teal reported to me, the lady read with her hand and fingers, even when he pressed a note against the back of her neck. She read it instantly, but in this case actual contact was necessary. In the case of a governess, artificially brought to the state of waking trance by Mr. Williamson, the same faculty was observed. With one hand she used to hold open the book to be read, resting it against her chest, the pages being turned away from her. The contents of these she read fluently, touching the words with the forefinger of the other hand. In one very interesting case, which I witnessed here in the autumn of 1849, the young lady, clairvoyant through mesmerism, sitting in the corner of a sofa, something reclined, would have seen, had she peeped through a linear aperture between her seemingly closed eyelids, the lower half of things only. As it was, the reverse was the fact, and when we asked her what she saw, she told us the cornice and upper part of the room. Then, without saying anything, I raised my cap upon my stick to within her declared range of trance vision. She exclaimed, "Ah, Guillaume Tell!" Her mother, whom she heard speak, but had not hitherto seen in this trance, she recognized at once when she stood up upon a chair. To read in this trance appeared a very painful effort to her, but she was certainly able to make out some words when she pressed a written paper against her forehead. It was evident that she could now visually discern things by some new faculty of apprehension localized there. To enable her to see things at a few feet distance, they had equally to be placed opposite to her forehead. In another case, in which the girl, when entranced, certainly saw with the knuckles of one hand, on smearing the back of that hand with ink, she could no longer see with it. The above instances show how various are the features attending the transposition of one sense alone in waking trance, and they suggest a multitude of experiments. I remember in 1838, on communicating facts of this kind to a clear-headed practical man, he raised this objection to their credibility: if we can see without eyes, why has the Creator given us eyes? The objection is specious enough, but it admits of an obvious answer. The state of trance is one of disease, transient and temporary. It is during its persistence only that this new power of apprehension is manifested. In our natural state, the mind is intended to operate and try experiences in subordination to matter and through definite material organs in which it is in truth imprisoned. Such is the law of our normal mortal being. Accordingly, when the trance is over and the mind has returned to its normal relations with the body, all its trance apprehensions are forgotten by it. They form no part of our moral life. 3 sources of error in the communications of entranced persons. I put aside cases of deliberate deception, but when persons are really entranced, they are liable in various ways to be deceived themselves and to deceive others as to the value of their revealments. There is often in waking trance a great vivacity and disposition to be communicative from the first. Those again who have frequently been thrown into trance and have become familiar with their new condition are generally anxious to shine in it and make a display. This disposition is further heightened when the entranced person expects to be rewarded for his performance. 1. When indulging their lively fancy, they are liable to have a sort of waking dream, during which they describe imaginary scenes with the precision and minuteness of reality, and represent them as actual passing at some place they name. 2. They are liable to recall past impressions and to deliver bits of old conclusions for intuitions. 3. They are liable to adopt the thoughts of others who may be near them, especially those of their mesmerizer, and to deliver them as trance revelations. 4. In one instance which came to my knowledge, a young lady, previously unacquainted with mathematics or astronomy, would, when entranced, and sitting with her mother and sister, write fluently off pages of an astronomical treatise, calculations, diagrams, and all. She averred and believed in her entranced state, for when awake it was all a mystery to her that this performance was the product of an intuition. Her manuscript was afterwards found to run word for word with an article in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. That book, however, stood in the library in a remote part of the house. She certainly had it not with her when she used to scribble its contents, nor did she remember ever having looked into it, awake or asleep. She said, when entranced, and this had been found out, that she believed she read the book as it stood in the library. 5. With some imperfectly lucid patients, the exercise of their new faculties appears to be fatiguing and to call for great exertion, so they are occasionally with difficulty led to answer at all, and then when inconsiderately pressed, they are tempted to say anything just to be left tranquil. It is difficult to say how the preceding sources of error are to be effectually guarded against. Possibly by rigid training from the first, the patient might be brought to distinguish false promptings from genuine intuitions, but even the latter vary in lucidity and certainty. This admission was made to a friend of mine by M.R.S., the celebrated Parisian clairvoyant. The reader cannot fail to be interested by the following account, given by M.R.S. when entranced, of his own powers and their mode of operation. Pour voir des objets éloignés, observed M.R.S., mon âme ne se dégage pas de mon corps. C'est ma volonté qui dirige mon âme, mon esprit, sans sortir de cette chambre où je suis. Si mon âme sortit, je serais mort. C'est ma volonté. Ma volonté suffit pour anéantir pour quelque temps la matière. ainsi quand cette volonté est en jeu, la boîte matérielle de mon individu n'est plus. Les murs, l'espace et même le temps n'existent plus, mais ce n'est qu'un rêve plus ou moins lucide. Quelquefois ma vue est meilleure, car d'autres ma vue n'est jamais la même. Une fois je suis disposé pour voir une sorte de chose, et une autre fois une autre sorte. En regardant votre chambre dans un quartier éloigné d'ici, je ne vois pas les rues ni les maisons intermédiaires. La seule chose alors qui est dans la pensée est la personne qui me parle. Je vois les objets d'une manière plus incomplète que par mes sens moins sûrs. Il serait impossible de faire comprendre comment je vois. Plus il y a de l'attraction, plus j'éprouve de l'attraction aux objets que je veux voir ou qui me touchent. Plus il y a de lumière, plus j'éprouve de répulsion, plus il y a de ténèbres. 4. Of the different qualities of odd in different individuals, von Reichenbach observed the odd light to have different colors under different circumstances, and that, while odd negative produces the sensation of a draught of cool air, odd positive produces a sense as of a draught of warm air. An easy way to verify the last phenomenon is to beg someone to hold the forefinger of the right hand pointed to your left palm at a quarter of an inch distance, and afterwards his left forefinger to your right palm, when the two sensations and their difference are appreciable by the majority of persons. Persons entranced by mesmeric procedures are often keenly alive to the above impressions. They see light emanating from the finger-tips of the mesmerizer, and feel an agreeable afflatus from his manipulations. Others who approach them affect them in different ways, some not disagreeably, while others excite a chilly, shivering feeling, and the patient begs they will keep off from him. A gentleman narrated to me the following case. He had been for months in anxious attendance upon a brother who was in very delicate health and exquisitely sensitive to mesmerism. My friend used himself to mesmerize his brother, but he found it necessary, in order to soothe and not excite him by the passes, to cover the patient with a folded blanket, so as to dull the agency of his odd emanation. There was but another person of several who had been tried, whose hand the brother could bear at all. This was a maid-servant, who herself was highly susceptible, and became entranced. She said that she perceived, when entranced, the suitableness of her influence and that of the brother to the patient, and she used the singular expression that they were nearly of a color. She said that the patient's odd emanation was of a pink color, and that the brother's was a brick color, a flatter, deeper red, and she endeavored to find someone else with the same colored odd to suit her master. In some experiments made at Dr. Leighton's house in Gower Street, I remember it was distinctly proved that each of the experimenters produced different effects on the same person. The patient was one of the Okies of mesmeric celebrity. The party consisted of Dr. Elliotson, Mr. Wheatstone, Dr. Grant, Mr. Kiernan, and some others. Mr. Wheatstone tabulated the results. Each of us mesmerized a sovereign, and it was found that on each trial the trance coma, which contact with the thus mesmerized gold induced, had a characteristic duration for each of us. Is it possible that each living person has his distinguishable measure of odd, either in intensity or quality? 5. The odd force is the usual channel of establishing mesmeric relation. I take it for granted that the odd force, the existence, and some of the properties of which have been inductively ascertained by von Reichenbach, is the same agent with that which Mesmer assumed to be the instrument in his operations. Then, in support of the above proposition, I cite two instances. Mr. Williamson, at my request, mesmerized and entranced the Reverend Mr. Fox at Weilbach in the autumn of 1847. It was the second sitting, and Mr. Fox was beginning to pass from the initiatory stage of trance into trance half waking. Mr. Williamson addressed him, and he returned an answer. Other parties in the room, including myself, then addressed Mr. Fox, and he seemed not to hear one of us. Then Mr. Williamson gave me his hand, and I again spoke to Mr. Fox. He then heard me and spoke in answer. When, having left go Mr. Williamson's hand, I spoke again to Mr. Fox. He heard me not. On my renewing contact with Mr. Williamson, Mr. Fox heard me again. He heard me as long as I was brought into relation with him, and that relation was clearly due to the establishment of an odd current between myself and Mr. Williamson, with whom Mr. Fox was already in trance relation. Every one who has seen something of mesmerism will recognize in the above story one of its commonest phenomena. But a more conclusive instance still has been already mentioned in Letter 10. M. Pétain made a chain of 7 persons holding hands, the 7th holding the hand of a cataleptic patient, who at that time heard by her fingers only. When Dr. Pétain spoke to the fingers of the first, that is, the most remote person of the chain, the cataleptic person heard him as well as if he had spoken to her own fingers. Even when a stick was made to form part of the circuit, the cataleptic still heard Dr. Pétain's whisper uttered at the other end of the chain. Not so, however, if one of the parties forming the chain wore silk gloves. 6. Trans-identification of persons at a distance by means of material objects. A very lucid clairvoyante, her eyes being bandaged, recognizes not the less, without preparation or effort, every acquaintance present in the room, describes their dress, the contents of their purses, or of letters in their pockets, and reads their innermost thoughts. An ordinary clairvoyante usually requires the contact of the party's hand with whom it is proposed to bring her into trance relation. Then only does she first know anything about her new patient. It cannot be doubted that in the latter case it is the establishment of an odd current between the two that enables the mind of the clairvoyante to penetrate the interior being of the visitor, just as in the humblest effects of common mesmerism a relation is sensibly established between the party entranced and her mesmerizer through the odd current which he had previously directed upon her in order to produce the trance. So far all is theoretically clear enough. But how is the establishment of the same relation between the clairvoyante and a party wholly unknown to her, and residing many miles off, to be explained, when the only visible medium of physical connection employed has been a lock of hair or a letter written by the distant party and placed in the hands of the clairvoyante? Let me begin by giving the explanation, and afterwards exemplify the phenomenon out of my own experience. I conceive that a lock of hair, or the letter on which his hand has rested, is charged with the odd fluid emanating from the distant person, and that the clairvoyante measures exactly the force and quality of this dose of odd, and as it were individualizes it. Then, using this clue, distance being annihilated to the entranced mind, it seeks for, or is drawn towards, whatever there is more of this same individual odd quality anywhere in space. When that is found, the party sought is identified and brought into relation with the clairvoyant, who proceeds forthwith to tell all about him. Now, for an exemplification of this marvelous phenomenon, being at Boppard, a letter of mine addressed to a friend in Paris was by him put into the hands of Monsieur Alexis, who was asked to describe me. Monsieur Alexis told at once my age and stature, my disposition, and my illness, how that I am entirely crippled, and at that time of the day, 11:30 a.m., was in bed. All this, to be sure, Monsieur Alexis might have read in my friend's mind without going farther, but he added, "This gentleman lives on the sea coast." My friend denied the assertion, but Monsieur Alexis continued very positive that he was right. Now, most oddly, the Rhine, on the banks of which I resided then, is at Boppard, the boundary of Prussia, and I never cross it or visit Nassau, but I am in the habit of sitting on the bank, listening to the breaking of the surge, which the passing steamers create, and which exactly resembles the murmur of the sea. This very mistake of Monsieur Alexis helped to convince me that this performance of his was genuine. However, being stoutly contradicted by my friend, Monsieur Alexis reconsidered the matter, and said no, he does not live on the sea-coast, but on the Rhine, 20 leagues from Frankfurt. This answer was exact, but there was another point which Monsieur Alexis hit with curious felicity. I should observe that this friend was one of a few months' date, who had no means of comparing what I am with what I was formerly. But it had happened that I had written, not to him, but to a friend resident in England about the same time, that, ill as I was, my mind was singularly clear and active, and that I regarded the fact as a sign my end was at hand, that the mental brightness probably resembled the flaring up of a rushlight before it goes out. Well, Monsieur Alexis, adverting to my condition, observed that I was extremely weak, and had suffered much from irritation of the nerves. Facts true enough, but which certainly would not have led him to infer the existence of that clearness of mind which I had myself remarked. Nevertheless, strangely added Monsieur Alexis, le moral n'en est pas atteint. Au contraire, l'esprit est plus dégagé et plus vif qu'auparavant. I can therefore entertain no doubt that at 400 miles distance, merely by handling a recent letter from me, Monsieur Alexis had identified me as its writer through the odd fluid the letter conveyed, and had truly penetrated my physical and mental being so completely, the most that was important in my story lay distinctly revealed before him. 7. Mental travelling by clairvoyance. Let me begin with an instance. The following extract from the Zoist contains a very interesting narrative by Lord Ducie, which is exactly to the point. In the highest departments or phenomena of mesmerism, he for a long time was a disbeliever, and could not bring himself to believe in the power of reading with the eyes bandaged, or of mental travelling. At length, however, he was convinced of the truth of those powers, and that too in so curious and unexpected a way, that there could have been no possibility of deception. It happened that he had to call upon a surgeon on business, and when he was there, the surgeon said to him, "You have never seen my little clairvoyante?" He replied that he never had, and should like to see her very much. He was invited to call the next day, but upon his replying that he should be obliged to leave town that evening, he said, "Well, you can come in at once. I'm obliged to go out, but I will ring the bell for her, and put her to sleep, and you can ask her any questions you please." He, Lord Ducie, accordingly went in. He had never been in the house in his life before, and the girl could have known nothing of him. The bell was rung. The clairvoyante appeared. The surgeon, without a word passing, put her to sleep, and then he put on his hat and left the room. He, Lord Ducie, had before seen something of mesmerism, and he sat by her, took her hand, and asked her if she felt able to travel. She replied, yes, and he asked her if she had ever been in Gloucestershire, to which she answered that she had not, but should very much like to go there, as she had not been in the country for 6 years. She was a girl of about 17 years old. He told her that she should go with him, for he wanted her to see his farm. They travelled mentally by the railroad very comfortably together, and then, in his imagination, got into a fly and proceeded to his house. He asked her what she saw, and she replied, "I see an iron gate and a curious old house." He asked her, "How do you get to it?" She replied, "By this gravel walk," which was quite correct. He asked her how they went into it, and she replied, "I see a porch, a curious old porch." It was probably known to many that his house, which was a curious old Elizabethan building, was entered by a porch, as she had described. He asked her what she saw on the porch, and she replied truly that it was covered with flowers. He then said, "Now we will turn in at our right hand. What do you see in that room?" She answered with great accuracy, "I see a bookcase and a picture on each side of it." He told her to turn her back to the bookcase and say what she saw on the other side, and she said, "I see something shining like that which soldiers wear." She also described some old muskets and warlike implements which were hanging in the hall, and upon his asking her how they were fastened up, meaning by what means they were secured. She mistook his question, but replied, "The muskets are fastened up in threes," which was the case. He then asked of what substance the floors were built, and she said of black and white squares, which was correct. He then took her to another apartment, and she very minutely described the ascent to it as being by 4 steps. Lord Ducie, told her to enter by the right door, and say what she saw there. She said, "There is a painting on each side of the fireplace." Upon his asking her if she saw anything particular in the fireplace, she replied, "Yes, it is carved up to the ceiling," which was quite correct, for it was a curious old Elizabethan fireplace. There was at Totworth Court a singular old chestnut tree, and he told her that he wished her to see a favourite tree, and asked her to accompany him. He tried to deceive her by saying, "Let us walk close up to it," but she replied, "We cannot, for there are railings round it." He said, "Yes, wooden railings," to which she answered, "No, they are of iron," which was the case. He asked, "What tree is it?" and she replied that she had been so little in the country that she could not tell, but upon his asking her to describe the leaf, she said, "It is a leaf as dark as the geranium leaf, large, long, and jagged at the edges." He, Lord Ducie, apprehended that no one could describe more accurately than that the leaf of the Spanish chestnut. He then told her he would take her to see his farm, and desired her to look over a gate into a field which he had in his mind, and tell him what she saw growing. She replied that the field was all over green, and asked if it was potatoes, adding that she did not know much about the country. It was not potatoes, but turnips. He then said, "Now look over this gate to the right, and tell me what is growing there." She at once replied, "There is nothing growing there. It is a field of wheat, but it has been cut and carried." This was correct, but knowing that in a part of the field grain had been sown at a different period, he asked her if she was sure that the whole of it had been cut. She replied that she could not see the end of the field, as the land rose in the middle, which in truth it did. He then said to her, "Now we are on the brow, can you tell me if it is cut?" She answered, "No, it is still growing here." He then said to her, "Now let us come to this gate. Tell me where it leads to." She replied, "Into a lane." She then went on and described everything on his farm with the same surprising accuracy, and upon his subsequently inquiring, he found that she was only in error in one trifling matter, for which error any one who had ever travelled mentally with a clairvoyante could easily account, without conceiving any breach of the truth. If the preceding example stood alone, or if in parallel cases no further phenomena manifested themselves, nothing more would be required to explain the facts than to suppose that the mental fellow-traveller reads all your thoughts, and adopts your own imagery and impressions. But there are not wanting cases in which the fellow-traveller has seen what was not in his companion's mind, and was at variance with his belief, while subsequent inquiry has proved that the clairvoyant's unexpected story was true. These more complicated cases prove that the clairvoyante actually pays a mental visit to the scene, but she can do more. She can pass on to other and remoter scenes and places, of which her fellow-traveller has no cognizance. For example, a young person whom Mr. Williamson mesmerized became clairvoyant. In this state she paid me a mental visit at Boppard, and Mr. Williamson, who had been a resident there, was satisfied that she realized the scene. Afterwards I removed to Weilbach, where Mr. Williamson had never been. Then he proposed to the clairvoyante to visit me again. She reached, accordingly, in mental travelling, my former room in Boppard, and expressed surprise and annoyance at not finding me there, and at observing others in its occupation. Mr. Williamson proposed that she should set out and try to find me. She said, "You must help me." Then Mr. Williamson said, "We must go up the river some way till we come to a great town, Mainz." The clairvoyante said she had got there. Then, said Mr. Williamson, we must now go up another river, the Mine, which joins our river at this town, and try and find Dr. Mayo on its banks somewhere. Then the clairvoyante said, oh, there is a large house. Let us go and see it. No, there are two large houses, one white, the other red. Upon this, Mr. Williamson proposed that she should go into one of the two houses and look about. She quickly recognized my servant, went mentally into my room and found me, and described a particular or two which were by no means likely to be guessed by her. When Mr. Williamson subsequently came to visit me at Weilbach, he was forcibly struck with the appearance of the two houses, which tallied with the account given beforehand by the mental traveller. I've not the smallest doubt she mentally realized my new abode. Then how did she do all this? The first question is, how does the clairvoyante realize scenes which are familiar to her fellow traveller? I cannot help inclining to the belief that in the ordinary perception of a place or person, the mind acts exoneurally, and that our apprehension, as I have ventured to conjecture in Letter 5, comes thus always into a direct relation with the place or person. There is a peculiar vividness in a first impression, which every one must have observed. There is no renewing that force of impression again. This fact helps my hypothesis. It will be remembered again that in Zachoki's narrative of his seer gift, he never penetrated the minds of his visitors unless at their very first visit. It is the same, even to a certain extent, with mesmeric inspection of the mind. My friend who consulted Monsieur Alexis for me consulted him likewise for himself more than once. At the first visit, Monsieur Alexis traced an aggravation of his illness a year before to distress occasioned by the death of two younger brothers at a short interval. On my friend's subsequent visits, Monsieur Alexis marked no knowledge at all of the latter occurrence. Slightly as these facts are connected, they concurrently strengthen my notion of the occurrence of an exoneural act of the mind in common perception. I suspect, I repeat, that at visiting new places the mind establishes a direct relation with the scenes or persons. Then, in the simplest case of mental visiting, where the scene visited is familiar to the other party, I presume that the clairvoyante's mind, being in communion with the mind of the other, realizes scenes which the latter has previously exoneurally realized. Arriving thus at the scene itself, the clairvoyante observes for herself and sees what may be new in it and unknown to her fellow traveller, and in the same way may pursue, as in the mental visit made to myself at Weilbach, suggested features of the locality, and be thus helped to beat about in space for new objects, and at length to recognize among them and mentally identify persons with whom she has already arrived at a mental mesmeric relation. 8. Mesmerizing at a distance, mesmerizing by the will. I've not heard of a case in which a person has been, for the first time, mesmerized with effect by one out of the room. Generally, the mesmerizer is very near to his patient at the first sitting, often actually holding his hand, at all events so near that the odd emanation of his person might be expected to reach the patient, and the patient is often sensible of new sensations which he is disposed to attribute to the physical agency of the operator on him. In Mr. Braid's cases, it seemed to me clear that the effects were mainly brought about, as in common mesmerism, by his personal influence. Afterwards, when a patient has by use become highly sensitive to odd and disposed to fall into trance, I have myself, by making passes in the next room, succeeded in producing the sleep, and I've seen, with open doors, mesmeric effects produced by passes at the distance of 90 feet. But with persons rendered through use extremely susceptible of mesmeric impression, an effect may be produced by the habitual mesmerizer of the patient at almost unlimited distances. The following instance is given by Dr. Froisac in his valuable work on mesmerism entitled Rapport et discussion sur le magnétisme animal, Paris, 1838. Dr. Foisac speaks in the first person of an experiment made by himself on a patient of the name of Paul of Villagrand, whom he had been in the habit of mesmerizing in the usual way at Paris, where both resided. In the course of the June ensuing, says Dr. Foisac, Paul expressed the wish to pass some days in his native place, Magnac-Laval, Haute-Vienne. I provided him with the means and proposed to turn his journey to scientific account by attempting to entrance him at the distance of 100 leagues. He was not to know my intention before the time came, but on the 2nd of July, at 5:30 p.m., his father was to give him a note from me which ran thus: I'm magnetizing you at this moment. I will awake you when you have had a quarter of an hour's sleep. Monsieur Villagrand made the success of the experiment the more decisive by not handing over my letter to his son, and so disregarding my instructions. Nevertheless, at 10 minutes before 6, Paul, being in the midst of his family, experienced a sensation of heat and considerable uneasiness. His shirt was wet through with perspiration. He wished to retire to his room, but they detained him. In a few minutes he was entranced. In this state he astonished the persons present by reading with his eyes shut several lines of a book taken at hazard from the library, and by telling the hour upon a watch they held to him. He awoke in a quarter of an hour. One naturally doubts whether the physical influence of the odd force can extend to this enormous distance, whether the agency ought not to be regarded as purely psychical, whether, in short, the will of the speaker may not have been the exclusive agent employed. I think that there is a disposition among experimenters in mesmerism to attribute too much to the agency of the will. There was with me in the autumn of 1849 a young lady who was extremely susceptible of mesmerism. A gentleman who came with the family had been in the habit of entrancing her daily, and at last she was so sensitive that a wave of his hand would fix her motionless. His presence even in the room affected her, and if he then tried to mesmerize her sisters, she herself invariably became entranced. The operator was a person of remarkable mesmeric power. Then, at my request, made unknown to her, he went to the end window of the room, and looking out upon the Rhine, tried at the same time with the most forcible mental efforts to will her into sleep. The attempt failed entirely. Another day that he was in my room, about 50 feet from the room in which the young lady was sitting, he tried again by the will to entrance her, but it was all in vain. Therefore, if the will ever acts independently of odd influence, I am disposed to think that its action in producing trance must be infinitely feebler than the direct use of odd. However, some are convinced of the positive agency of the will in mesmerizing. The following statement by Mr. H.S. Thompson of Fairfield, made in letter to Dr. Elliotson, published in the Zoist, admits the inferiority in force of the will to the material agency of odd, at the same time that it goes far to prove its efficiency. I've succeeded, says Mr. Thompson, in arresting spasms and taking away every species of pain, and in producing intense heat and perspiration by the will only, and in many instances without the knowledge of the patients, who have been all unconscious of the power I have been exerting, until after the results have occurred. At the same time I have generally found that the passes, in combination with the will or attention, most readily produce the effects we desire, and that manipulations are much less fatiguing to the operator than the exertion of the will. Of an extremely sensitive patient who was suffering with rheumatic pains, Mr. H.S. Thompson observes, a few passes put her to sleep, though she was moaning as in great pain, and scarcely seemed to notice what I was doing. After sleeping for a few minutes, her face became composed, and she showed no symptoms of pain, but as I could not get her to speak in her sleep, I awakened her. She looked very much surprised, and said that she felt very comfortable and free from pain. I told my friend that she was so sensitive that I thought that she might be put to sleep by the will in a few minutes. The bed curtains were drawn so that she could not see or know what was going on. I fixed my attention upon her, wishing her to go to sleep. When we looked at her 2 minutes afterwards, she was fast asleep. It was agreed that the following day, though I should be 30 miles off, the experiment should be tried again. A lady went at the time fixed on. I purposely postponed the time half an hour, thinking that the woman might have become acquainted with my intention, and go to sleep through the power of the imagination. The lady's account was, that she called upon the woman at the time agreed on, and at first thought the experiment was going to fail, as she saw no symptoms of sleep, but that in half an hour afterwards the patient went into a deep sleep, which lasted some time. After this she went to sleep every day for a fortnight at the same time, though I did not will her to sleep. She says that she felt in a dreamy and happy state for some days after. I might add many similar facts to the above interesting observations. The mass of evidence existing on the subject establishes beyond all doubt that patients have been thrown into trances by persons who have previously mesmerized them in the common way, at distances which seem to preclude the idea of any physical agent having been the medium of communication between the two parties. The operation seems to have been in those instances mental. Then how is such a result to be explained, or by what expression can it be brought to tally with the principles I am endeavouring to substantiate? I shape the answer thus. The first step is ordinary mesmerizing. In other words, the operator directs an odd current upon the patient, the odd in whose system is thereby disturbed, and initiatory trance ensues as the consequence. Secondly, the mind of the patient, thus entranced, enters into relation with, or is attracted towards, the mind or person of the mesmerizer. I remember witnessing a most decisive instance in which the operation of this attraction was singularly manifested. The place was Dr. Elliotson's waiting room, the patient a young man whom Mr. Simpson had entranced. Mr. Simpson then moved about the room, standing still at several points in it in succession. The young man seemed attracted towards Mr. Simpson, to whom he drew near each time he stopped. Then he pressed against Mr. Simpson, jostling him out of his place, which he planted himself in, his countenance bearing an expression of huge delight at what he had achieved. But in half a minute he began to look anxious and uneasy, and again, his eyes being shut all the while, he set off in search of Mr. Simpson, and repeated the same scene. There exists, it would appear, an attraction between the mind of the entranced person and that of his mesmerizer, or that of any other person with whom the entranced person has secondarily come into relation. Then thirdly, it may be presumed that in phenomena which are purely mental, space and distance go for nothing. But if this supposition be admitted, it would be as easy for a mesmerizer to entrance by a mental effort a sensitive and habituated patient at 100 miles off as at the end of the same room. The phenomenon thus viewed is wholly exoneural. The one mind is supposed to be actually sensitive to the influence of the other. Each of the two minds, though in different degrees, energizes, it may be imagined, beyond its bodily frame, and the mind of the patient feels the force of the mesmerizer's will acting upon it, and slips, as it were, at once, by the accustomed track, out of the normal into the abnormal physico-neural relation. Still I cannot get rid of a lurking notion that in the phenomena last considered the odd force contributes an element of physical or psychico-dynamic influence. For putting for the moment aside the idea of mental action, what is to prevent two living bodies that may be in odd relation or in exact odd unison from physically influencing one another at indefinite distances? 9. Trance diagnosis. From Boppard, where I was residing in the winter of 1845-6, I sent to an American gentleman residing in Paris a lock of hair which Colonel C. an invalid then under my care, had cut from his own head and wrapped in writing paper from his own writing desk. Colonel C. was unknown even by name to this American gentleman, who had no clue whatever whereby to identify the proprietor of the hair, and all that he had to do and did was to place the paper enclosing the lock of hair in the hands of a noted Parisian somnambulist. She stated in the opinion she gave on the case that Colonel C. had partial palsy of the hips and legs, and that for another complaint he was in the habit of using a surgical instrument. The patient laughed heartily at the idea of the distant somnambulist having so completely realized him. The mesmeric discrimination of disease involves 3 degrees. First, the clairvoyant, placed in relation with the patient either by taking his hand or by handling a lock of his hair or anything impregnated with his odd, feels all his feelings, realizes his sensations, and describes what he sensibly labors under. Her account of the case thus obtained will be more or less happy according to the extent of her previous knowledge respecting ordinary disease. Secondly, the clairvoyant, if in a higher state of lucidness, actually sees and inspects the interior bodily construction of the patient, whose inward organs are, as it would seem, lit with odd light for her examination, or she sees them by their odd light being in mesmeric relation with the internal frame of the patient. Thirdly, the clairvoyant, if still more lucid, foresees what will be the progress of the malady, what further organic changes are threatened, what will be the patient's fate. The first 2 points require no further comment. I reserve my comments upon the last for another head. 10. Mesmeric treatment. Let me first advert to the use of artificial trance as an anesthetic agent in the service of surgery. There is no doubt that when a patient can thus be deprived of ordinary sensibility, the resource is preferable to the employment of chloroform. Not only is it absolutely free from risk, but its direct effect is to soothe and tranquilize, whereas chloroform is but a powerful narcotic, the effects of which are obtained through a brief stage of violent physical excitement. Then at each dressing at any moment, in short, when advisable, mesmerism may be again resorted to, which chloroform cannot. The honor of having been the first to employ mesmerism systematically as an anesthetic agent belongs to James Esdale, M.D., Presidency Surgeon at Calcutta. The reports of his success in a vast body of cases, many of the most serious description, are given in the Zoist. A second point is the employment of artificial trance as a universal sedative, as a means from which, in all cases purely nervous, the most admirable results may be expected and are realized, and from which, in disease in general, singular and beneficial effects have been obtained. This success was confidently to be anticipated the instant that the real nature of mesmeric phenomena was appreciated. A third point is the employment of mesmeric passes, without the intentional power to produce trance, simply as a local means of tranquilizing the nervous sensibility of a diseased part, and allaying the morbid phenomena which depend upon local nervous irritation. There is a fourth point under this head which will be regarded as more questionable, viz. The power attributed to clairvoyants of prescribing treatment for themselves and others. Nevertheless, in their own cases, where the prescriptions have been limited to baths and bleeding, and mesmerism itself, the boldness and precision of their practice and its success have been such as to excite our wonder and almost to command our confidence. It does not, however, seem that the treatment prescribed by clairvoyants to others is equally certain, and when they recommend drugs, it is clear that, adopting the fashion of the time and country in medicine, they are only prescribing by guess, like other doctors, but they sometimes guess very cleverly. 11. Phrenomesmerism. How great is my regret that I can no longer take an active part in physiological inquiry. How great is my regret that in former years, when I worked at the physiology of the nervous system, I undervalued phrenology, prejudiced against it by the writings of the late Dr. Gordon, by the authority of my early instructors, by the puerile mode in which craniology was generally advocated, by the superficial quality of the cerebral anatomy of Gall. I confined my attention to what I considered sounder objects of investigation. But now I have no doubt not only that the metaphysical speculations of Gall were in the main just, but likewise that a great part of his craniological chart is accurately laid down. To connect phrenology with severe anatomical research, to endeavour to determine the organic conditions which interfere with the application of the science to practical purposes, would be a task worthy the efforts of the best physiological labourer. Then, if phrenology be true, and the organology in the main correct, what is more likely than that, directing an odd current upon the cerebral seat of a mental faculty, should bring it into activity? I have myself witnessed the repetition of this now common experiment in a very unexceptionable instance, and the success was perfect. The organs of veneration, of combativeness, of alimentiveness were successively excited, and in each case a brilliant piece of acting followed. I must confess, however, that I could not divest myself of the impression that whatever pains we took to conceal our plans, the clairvoyant young lady really knew beforehand what was expected of her, and performed accordingly. I speak in reference to the single instance which I have myself witnessed. I cannot, however, refuse to credit the testimony of good observers, such as Dr. Elliotson, to facts which seem to establish the genuineness of phrenomesmerism. In its double relation to phrenology and mesmerism, this inquiry well merits attention. 12. Rapport, mesmeric relation, psychical attraction. without presuming to place absolute confidence in the preceding speculations, but on the contrary, apologizing for their hypothetical character on the plea that any theory is better than none, let me now recapitulatorily put in array the facts and principles to which the terms at the head of this section refer. 1. I hold that the mind of a living person in its most normal state is always to a certain extent acting exoneurally, or beyond the limit of the bodily person, but possibly always in conjunction with some odd operation. 2. I suppose that there must be laws of neuropsychical attraction, or that there are definite circumstances which determine our exoneural apprehension to direct itself upon this or that object or person. So in common perception, the exoneural apprehension probably moves back along the lines of material impression to reach the object perceived which so attracts it. So in sudden liking or aversion at first sight, or more properly on all occasions of meeting strangers, an exoneural mingling of reciprocal appreciation takes place, different persons being differently gifted with intuitive discernment, as others are the same with powers of pleasingly affecting most they meet. So Zajoki's seer gift would have been but the result of a greater exoneural mobility of his mind, whereby he was occasionally drawn to such mental affinity with the stranger that he knew his whole life and circumstances. So in panic, fierce in all cases where impressions seem heightened by the sympathy of many, the power of psychical attraction we may presume to be increased by its concentration on one subject, and the participation of all in one thought. The Reverend Herr Townsend, in his interesting work on mesmerism, declares that he has more than once succeeded in the following fact of sympathetic mental influence. All the members of a party then present have conspired against an expected visitor, and when he came, carefully at the same time abstaining from alluding to some special subject agreed on, they have striven silently and mentally to drive it into his thoughts, and in a short time he has spoken of it. 3. For the most lucid persons in waking trance, either of spontaneous occurrence, as in catalepsy, or when induced by mesmerism, the exoneural apprehension seems to extend to every object and person round, and to be drawn into complete intelligence of or with them. Such a patient is en rapport, or in transmental relation with any or everything around, in succession or simultaneously. 4. In persons slowly waking in the most measured course of things out of artificial initiatory trance into somnambulism, the mind is at first exoneurally attracted to the mesmerizer alone. As a next step, the mesmerizer, by putting himself in odd relation with a third person, can make him participator in the same attraction. I do not here discuss Mr. Braid's views, which are more fully considered in a subsequent letter. I have analyzed trance in its character of a spontaneous pathological phenomenon. I have examined its principal features as they present themselves when it is induced by mesmerism, but facts have been brought forward by Mr. Braid which seem to establish that in some highly susceptible persons trance may be brought on at will in another way, by their own indirect efforts apart from external influences, as for instance by straining the eyes upwards, the attention being kept some time concentrated on the object or the effort. Certainly doing this makes the head feel uncomfortable and giddy, and seems as if it would lead to some kind of fit if indefinitely prolonged. 13. Trance prevision. Instances of trance prevision are referable to 3 different heads. 1. The simplest trance prevision is that of epileptic patients artificially entranced, who name at the distance of weeks beforehand the exact hour, nay minute, at which the next fit will occur. The case of Cazot, mentioned by Dr. Foisac, who was in the habit of predicting the accession of his fits with unerring precision, terminated, however, in the following manner. Cazot had predicted as usual when he should be next attacked. Before the time came round, however, he was thrown from a horse and killed. But no doubt can be entertained that, had he not met with this accident, the next fit would have occurred at the hour predicted. This is the simplest and narrowest form of prevision the clairvoyant can tell, in reference to himself or to any one with whom he is placed in relation, what will be the course of his health. He can see forward what the progress of his living economy will be, other things continuing the same. 2. The next feat is greater. Dr. Test, in his most interesting Manual de Magnétisme Animal, gives the case of a lady, his patient, who, when entranced, foretold the day and hour when an accident the nature of which she could not foresee, was to befall her, and from it a long series of illness was to take its rise. Dr. Test and the lady's husband were staying with her when the fatal moment approached. Then she rose, and making an excuse left the room, followed by her husband, when on opening a door a great grey rat rushed out, and she sank down in a fit of terror, and the predicted illness ensued. In this most decisive case, the prevision extended to an extraneous and accidental circumstance to which no calculation or intuition of her natural bodily changes could have led her. 3. But there are instances which reach yet farther. Dr. Foisac narrates the case of Mademoiselle Kerline, who, when in trance, predicted that she would be poisoned on a certain evening at a given hour. What would be the vehicle of the poison she could not foresee, either at the time when she first uttered the prediction, or on an occasion or two afterwards, when, being again entranced, she recurred to the subject. However, shortly before the day she was to be poisoned, being questioned and tranced as to the possibility of averting her fate, she said, "Throw me into the sleep a little before the time I have named, and then ask me whether I can discern where the danger lies." This was done, and Mademoiselle Kerline at once said that the poison was in a glass at her bedside. They had substituted for quinine an excessive dose of morphine. Thus it appears that persons in waking trance can first calculate what is naturally to follow in their own health, or in that of persons with whom they are in mesmeric relation; can secondly foretell the occurrence of fortuitous external events without seeing how to prevent them; can thirdly, when endowed with more lucidity, discern enough to enable them occasionally to counteract the natural course of external events. Fate thus becomes a contingency of certainties. There is a true series of consequences to be deduced from whatever partial premises the clairvoyant may happen to be acquainted with. When she has more data, that she makes a wider calculation certain as far as it goes, but other premises influencing the ultimate result may still have escaped her, so the utmost reach of genuine trance prevision is but the announcement of a probability which unforeseen events may counteract. I will conclude this head by introducing M. Alexis's account of his own powers of mesmeric prevision, in which the reader will see that his experience has led him to view his conclusions as calculations upon certain positive elements. Yet he admits the possibility of powers greater than his own. On peut prévoir l'avenir, said M. Alexis, mais lorsque cet avenir a des fondations positives, mais annoncé en fait isolé, un accident, une catastrophe, non. Cependant, quelquefois cela est arrivé aux individus, mais c'était des instruments de la divinité. Ces hommes sont rares, étant à une maison de jeu, je scarais d'avance la couleur gagnante, surtout aux cartes, mais à la roulette, cela me semble très difficile. Cela est de l'avenir. Les cartes au contraire sont dans les mains d'un homme quelques minutes. Cependant, si l'on voulait appliquer la clairvoyance à une exploitation semblable, je suis matériellement et moralement certain que là vous ferez faute. 14. Ultra-terrestrial vision. If a clairvoyant can discern what is passing at the distance of 100 leagues, why should not his perception extend to material objects beyond our sphere? Mr. Williamson tried to conduct one of his clairvoyants mentally to the moon, but having got some way, she declared the moon was so intolerably bright that the effort pained and distressed her, and accordingly Mr. Williamson relinquished the experiment and happened not to renew it. M. Alexis, when entranced in answer to my inquiries, declared himself cognizant of the condition of the planets. He said that they were inhabited, with the exception of those which are either too near to or too remote from the sun. He said that the inhabitants of the different planets are very diverse, that the earth is the best off, for that man has double the intelligence of the ruling animals in the other planets. It would be the height of credulity to regard this communication as more than a clever guess, yet a plausible guess it is, for if the other planets are composed of the same material elements with the earth, it is evident that the temperature of our planet must render these same materials more generally available for life and economic purposes. on it than they would be in Mercury or Saturn. 15. Ultra-vital vision. The following is M. Alexis's trance revelation as to the state of the soul after death. I presume it is no more than an ingenious play of his fancy, but a young clergyman of some acumen, to whom I communicated it, was half disposed to give it more credit, and observed with logical precision that, viewing the statement as an intuition, it would show the necessity of the resurrection of the body. L'âme ne change jamais. Après la mort, elle retourne à la divinité. Dieu a voulu attacher l'âme au corps, qui est en prison, ou Dieu a voulu enfermer l'âme pendant qu'elle est sur la terre. L'âme ne perd jamais son individualité. Après la mort, nos souvenirs ne nous restent pas. The last sentence is that to which my friend's remark principally referred. 16. Nature of the Supreme Being. The following striking expressions were made use of by M. Alexis when entranced in answer to a string of questions which I had sent to him on this subject. He declared at the same time that he had never before been led to consider it in his mesmeric state. I presume, therefore, that in his ordinary waking state he is a Spinozist, and that in place of an intuition he simply delivered an oracular announcement of his preconceived notions. Il n'y a pas de parole humaine qui peut donner une idée de la divinité. Dieu sait tout, il n'a pas de personnalité. Dieu est partout et nulle part. Dieu est la foyer qui allume la nature. Dieu est un foyer universel dont les hommes ne sont que la vapeur la plus éloignée, la plus faillible. Chaque homme est l'extrémité d'un rayon de lui-même. Il n'existe que Dieu. End of section 11.